Hey guys, I wanted to come on and give you a short and hopefully short and sweet video about how to interpret ABGs. So if you have been following along with my presentations, you will know that I have taught about acid-base balance. And that was just the basics, the very foundation of acid-base balance, just as this is the very basic how to interpret ABGs. Now, the key to ABGs, and it happens with EKGs as well, not to throw out a bunch of acronyms to you, but arterial blood gases is an art. It is a matter of practicing over and over and over again. And so even though I have about 5 practice problems at the end of this, I always encourage you to go back and try some more, okay? And I actually have a small master class, or you can schedule a one-to-one session with me to teach all about acid base and how to interpret ABGs. So let's get started here. First of all, we have to talk about the normal values. And if you've heard any of my other lectures, you've heard me say the words, normal values can change. Well, I can tell you this is the exception to the rule. Most normal values do change. For the most part, I have seen that ABG values are consistent across the board. So very quickly here, we're looking for a pH between 7.35 and 7.45. As I told you in the acid-base video, again, if you haven't watched it, you might want to go check it out. But there's a very narrow window of what is normal here, guys. So 7.35 to 7.45. PaCO2, I remember this from the 35 to 45 because it matches the digits in the pH values. So PaCO2, which is our carbon dioxide, is 35 to 45. PaO2, which is basically how much oxygen is circulating through the system, is between 80 and 100. Although I will tell you, for basic ABG evaluation, I do not use this number. Okay, so I do not teach you to use this number. I do not use this number, but it is a good number to have in your head. And then lastly, we have bicarb, which is abbreviated as HCO3. That is 21 to 28 milliequivalents per liter. So those are the normal numbers that you should have in your head for this. So let's talk about alkalosis versus acidosis. This is determined by the pH. Very simply put, if your pH is less than 7.35, that is considered acidosis, always and forever. If your pH is greater than 7.45, that is considered alkalosis. Now, how do I determine if it's respiratory or metabolic? And we'll get into this a little more in detail. But overall, if it is respiratory, your CO2 or carbon dioxide value will be abnormal. If it is a metabolic state, your bicarb will be the value that you'll look for to be abnormal. So let's look at these individually. So for the respiratory component of this, again, that's our PaCO2. So our carbon dioxide level is going to tell us whether or not this is a respiratory acidosis or respiratory alkalosis. And when we get to respiratory, it is an opposite relationship between pH and PaCO2. And what I mean by that is if you have an elevated pH, we expect the CO2 level to be down. So in a respiratory alkalosis state, you would see these numbers move in opposite directions of one another. So a high pH, you would expect to see a lower CO2 level. The exact opposite, when the pH is low, we anticipate a higher CO2 level, and that would be an acidosis kind of state. Again, if the PaCO2 is abnormal, then we're talking about a respiratory problem. Now, you may be asking me right this second, especially if you've had this information before, what about compensation? Well, let's not get confused about compensation just yet. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. So metabolic, again, we are looking for the bicarbonate, okay? If the bicarb is abnormal, then we have a metabolic component. Now, with the respiratory, we learned that the pH and the CO2 levels are reverse of each other. Well, what you're going to find in a metabolic problem is that the pH and the bicarb go in the same direction. So if I have an elevated pH, I'm anticipating that the bicarb will also be up in an abnormal situation. Okay, so in other words, metabolic acidosis or metabolic alkalosis. So in metabolic alkalosis, I anticipate the pH and the bicarb to both be elevated. Opposite is true for acidosis. I anticipate both of those numbers to be low or on the low end of normal. So again, if the bicarb is abnormal, then we're faced with a metabolic problem. So how do we go about analyzing the blood gas? I do this always and forever. Guys, I've been doing this for over 20 years, and I can tell you I analyze blood gases this way always and forever. This is how I learned it, and this is how I practiced it in the ICU for so many years. So the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at that pH, and I'm going to determine, is it too low or is it too high? So is it less than 7.35 or is it greater than 7.45? The second thing I'm going to look at is I'm going to look at the CO2. I'm going to determine, is the carbon dioxide level normal or abnormal? If it's abnormal, am I looking at a number that's high or low, and does it correlate with the pH? Remember, the carbon dioxide level is going to be the opposite of what the pH is. So if the pH is low, we anticipate the carbon dioxide level to be high, and reverse as well. Okay, so if the pH is too high, then we expect the CO2 or carbon dioxide level to be lower. Okay, if it does not have a opposite relationship, so this is 2B, does it have an opposite relationship with the pH? If it does not, then we move on to step 3, which is looking at the bicarb. And the first thing we have to do is determine if it's abnormal. If it's abnormal, is it high or low? And does it have a similar relationship with the pH? So remember, pH and carbon dioxide are going to have opposite relationships, while pH and bicarb are going to have similar relationships. So let's talk just a little bit about compensation, and this can confuse some people. So if you are confused, do not think that you are alone. You've got a couple of different options. You can rewatch this again until you kind of get it and it clicks in your brain. You can reach out and ask me questions, or you can schedule a one-to-one and we can actually go into more detail about this. But compensation is the body's ability to balance this abnormality. And what happens is, when the body tries to balance the abnormality, the other component will shift. And what I mean by that is, if I have a respiratory problem, so that means my pH is off and my CO2 is either too high or too low, depending on my pH, what happens is the body will either pull in too much bicarb or it will push away bicarb in order to shift that respiratory imbalance. Okay, so if it's a respiratory problem, then the bicarb will shift and kind of almost reach an abnormal state in order to make up or compensate for, this is where compensation comes in, to make up or compensate for this respiratory imbalance. And the opposite is true. If it's a metabolic imbalance, then the carbon dioxide will shift. Now, there's 2 types of compensation that you have. You have a full compensation and you have a partial compensation. And what I mean by this is, a full compensation means your pH will be normal, but your bicarb and your CO2 will be abnormal. Okay. Whereas with a partial compensation, the pH is still out of range. It is still abnormal, along with the bicarb being abnormal and the CO2 being abnormal. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. Again, if you need to hear it again, please go back and rewatch this. But a full compensation, my pH is normal, but my bicarb and CO2 are abnormal. If I have a partial compensation, my pH stays abnormal in addition to my bicarb and CO2 being abnormal. So let's take a look at this in an uncompensated acid-base imbalance. Okay, this chart helps me a whole lot, because what I would do if I were you is I would screenshot or take a picture or write this down or whatever works in your brains to know which direction these arrows should point if I have certain problems that fall. Okay, so if I'm being asked to interpret an arterial blood gas, I would have this chart out and I would look across the board. Is my pH high or low? Okay, so an arrow down means the pH is below 7.35. So that's respiratory acidosis and metabolic acidosis. Or is my pH high? That means greater than 7.45. So that would be both of the alkalosis states or alkalotic states, or however you want to say it. Okay. Next thing I want to look at is the carbon dioxide. Is it abnormal or is it normal? If it's normal, we know we have a respiratory problem. So using the chart, we would go back to the respiratory. The PaO2, again, remember I told you a lot of people, a lot of places like to use this number. They want you to memorize this number, but as you can see, there is only one condition where we anticipate this to be low, and that is in respiratory acidosis. Most other conditions, we anticipate this number to be normal. So let's move on. Bicarb, again, if it's normal, then we go back to, do we have a respiratory problem? If it's abnormal, then we begin to determine if we have metabolic acidosis or metabolic alkalosis. And then just as a side note, I didn't teach it in this because this is simply just a simple overview, but potassium, you notice there is clearly an issue with potassium. So in our acidosis states, respiratory and metabolic, you'll notice that the potassium is high, whereas in alkalotic states, the potassium is low. Let's take a look at a partially compensated. Again, if I have gone past that first chart and my blood gas that I'm interpreting doesn't look like any of that, let's move on to see if it's partially compensated. And again, you'll notice the pH here, this column here with our pH levels, they again remain high or low depending on alkalosis or acidosis. Your PaCO2 should look the same again. Remember, they go in opposite directions when it's respiratory. Okay, but what you'll notice here is metabolic throws a little wrench in it. Again, you see this O2 or oxygen levels. Again, not our problem here. And then take a look at the bicarbs. Okay, the bicarbs are going to be off as well. Whereas with a fully compensated imbalance, like I told you before, the pH is now normal, but you still see some abnormalities between the carbon dioxide and the bicarb. So let's try a couple here. So we have a pH of 7.30, a PaCO2 of 68, and an HCO3 or bicarbonate of 28. So let's take a look at this. Our pH is 7.3, which is high, which is low. We have a CO2, which is what we expect is high, and we have a relatively normal, because 21 to 28 is considered normal. We have a normal HCO3. So what we're dealing with here is a respiratory acidosis, and it's uncompensated because our pH is normal. Okay, our pH is normal. That is your key here, guys, the pH being normal. All right, let's look at this one. We have a pH of 7.00. What is this? It is way low. We are talking about severely acidotic here. Then we have a PaCO2 of 23. That's a little on the low side. But we have a bicarbonate of 12, which is also what? On the low side. Okay, so before we interpret this, I want you to remember, if it is a respiratory problem, it's going to be the opposite of your pH. So in this example, our pH and our CO2 or carbon dioxide level are in the same direction. They're both low. Also remember that the pH and the bicarb have a similar relationship. So if that's low, I should anticipate the bicarb being low, which it is. So therefore, that makes this automatically a metabolic acidosis, okay? Just from these two values alone, our pH and our bicarb, both are very low. That is considered a metabolic acidosis. Now, the key component here is that our carbon dioxide, our CO2 level, is also low. And remember, when both of our components are low, we then look to see what the relationship between these two numbers are. And now we have a partially compensated metabolic acidosis. Why? Because all values are low. If it were respiratory, we would expect the carbon dioxide to be elevated in acidosis. Therefore, that makes it metabolic acidosis, and it's partially compensated because all of the values are off. Hopefully that makes sense, guys. Hopefully that makes sense. All right, so let's go on to a little bit easier one. We have a pH of 7.60, which is high. We have a PaCO2 of 31. Remember, our normal is 35 to 45, so our carbon dioxide level is low. Our bicarb normal is 21 to 28, so that is normal. These two have an inverse relationship, which is what we expect. So this is respiratory alkalosis. Respiratory alkalosis. And it is not compensated because our bicarb is normal. Bicarb is normal. All right, let's try another one. 7.5 pH, that is an elevated or alkalosis. Our PaCO2 is 40. Remember, our normal is 35 to 45, so no problems there. And then our bicarb is 34. Remember, our normal is 21 to 28, so that is also high. When the pH is high, we anticipate the bicarb to be high, so this is metabolic alkalosis. And again, not compensated because the carbon dioxide level is normal. Really hope this makes sense. If not, please go back and rewatch it. I think this is our last one here. Practice. pH is 7.10, so that is low. Our PaCO2, that is 70. That is high, guys. 35 to 45 is our normal, so it's almost double the normal value. And then our bicarb is 24, which falls into a normal range, which puts this at respiratory acidosis. And it's uncompensated because the bicarb is normal. Well, just kidding. We do have another one. All right, so a pH of 7.39. That seems relatively normal, right? Our normal range for our pH is 7.35 to 7.45. So beautiful. Our PaCO2 or carbon dioxide should be 35 to 45. It's 27, so that means it's low. Our bicarb is 19. It should be 21 to 28, so it is also low. Now, what do we do in this situation is we look at where does the pH fall? The pH is normal, so we absolutely know that this is compensated, fully compensated. Because if you remember and you go back to the chart that I posted, in full compensation, our pH is normal. So how the heck do I determine what is going on here? Well, I'm going to tell you right now. What you need to do is look, is that pH closer to low normal or is it closer to high normal? Okay, remember our range is 7.35 to 7.45. So the right answer here is this pH is normal, but it is low normal. Then it goes back to what should the relationship be between the pH and the carbon dioxide? Remember, they should be opposite. So if the pH is on the low end of normal, I anticipate my CO2 to be much higher. Whereas the pH and the bicarb have a very similar relationship. So knowing that the pH is on the low side of normal and the bicarb is low as well, I am looking at a fully compensated metabolic acidosis. Okay, again, fully compensated because the pH is normal, but the lower end of normal, and because the bicarb is also low, it makes it a metabolic issue. So if you want more practice, just let me know. I'll be happy to share some more information. The more you practice, the better you become. Please, please, please go back and learn those steps that we talked about, okay? Let's put it in reverse, Terry. Let's go. Let's see where it was at. Right here, these are your steps to analyze. This is another one you should screenshot, write down, pause, do whatever you got to do. But always and forever, these are your top 3 steps to doing any blood gas interpretation. All right, I hope you guys found this helpful. If you do, leave me some comments, leave me some likes, leave me some love. I am hoping to get a video out for you guys about EKG interpretation, which is always fun. But anyways, let's start with ABGs. Don't forget to go back and look over the foundations. And if you need some more help, just let me know. All right, guys, I will talk to you next time. Bye-bye now.